All right, our last video ended. We were on this side. We had just talked about the literacy test. Another strategy that was used in the South was the poll tax. Poll, spelled P-O-L-L, just as it says there, meaning to cast a vote, to poll the people. There's a logic behind the. So what the poll tax was, if you wanted to vote, you had to pay this tax, the poll tax, in order to vote. The logic behind the poll tax was that it costs money to hold an election. You've got to have the polling sites, you've got to pay the workers, you've got to print the ballots, and so the logic is it costs money to hold this election. Therefore, the individuals that vote are users. So, if you want to vote, you've got to help pay for it. And that's how you pay for the election. Non-users don't vote; they don't have to pay for it. But if you vote, you got to pay for it. That's the issue. It's today we have a gas tax, and there's a great logic to this. You go to the pump, look on the pump. It'll tell you how much of that gallon of gasoline is how many cents are a tax. And it's around 55 cents in California. So 55 cents of every gallon of gasoline you pay for actually is both. There's some of that's a state tax, some of that's a federal tax. It might be actually a little higher than that in California. The logic is that if you're driving on the roads, you should help pay for the roads, and they do that per mile, per gallon, by this gasoline tax. That money is supposed to go to maintain the roads and build roads. So that's the logic of the poll tax as well. The problem was former slaves were poor and couldn't afford the tax. So if by chance a former slave could read, could they actually afford the poll tax? And the answer was no. Most of them could not afford the poll tax. They were sharecrop farmers. The sharecrop farmers really left them in a position almost indistinguishable from slavery. They often even were sharecrop farmers for their previous master. They would harvest their crops, pay the former master his share, pay their bills, and have very little left to even start for next year. Almost a condition indistinguishable from slavery. So they just didn't have the money to pay the poll tax, therefore they couldn't vote. Another strategy that was used to keep blacks from voting was the white primary. As you know, for every federal election, there are actually two elections. There's the primary, which determines who will be a party's candidate for that office. So you see right now with all the Democrats running for president of the United States, this is the primary. They're trying to decide which one of those Democrats will represent the Democratic Party in the presidential race at the end of the year. So the idea of the white primary was you could only vote in the primary if you were white. Therefore, they reasoned that blacks still had a say in who became in whatever office because they could vote in the general election. The problem was, so even if they could overcome the literacy test and pass it, and you've seen the problems with the literacy test by the Louisiana literacy test discussion board that you did, they were set up in such a way to make sure that the individual taking that test failed, because there were multiple ways the examiner could interpret a response. And if you missed one question, then you failed the test. So, this white primary left only those individuals in the general election who had been approved by the, quote, white voters in the primary election. There was never going to be a candidate in the general election that would have supported African American needs and desires, because they knew that ultimately they were only beholden to the whites because of the primary. The only way you'd get into the general election was to please those whites. And therefore they would represent the white interest. Then the grandfather clause comes along and reveals that all these previous strategies were nothing but a lie. So the literacy test, the poll tax, and the white primary were just a guise, because what the grandfather clause says is that if your grandfather had voted before 1867, you did not have to pay a poll tax. You did not have to pass a literacy test. And of course, the white primary didn't really matter on this one. So you did not have to pass a literacy test, and you did not have to pay a poll tax. This was a guise. It only fell on blacks. It was blacks' grandfathers who could not vote before 1867. So this was a neutral law on its face, but it was highly discriminatory. And so the grandfather clause revealed that this was a lie. Then furthermore, when all else failed, so even if blacks could pass the literacy test, even if they could pay the poll tax, when all else failed, if they could do that, they were harassed and intimidated if they showed up at the polls. This is what happened. Deplorable. It's deplorable to talk about, but what would be more deplorable is to act like it didn't happen. Now, there was a slow legal battle was used to overturn these laws. You might ask, why was it slow? Well, it was slow again because we're changing attitudes and dispositions. You just don't change those all at once. As we stated earlier, the grandfather clause was a guise, and that was recognized really pretty early on. In 1915, the grandfather clause was declared unconstitutional. Now, everybody had to pass the literacy test, again, showing you there's some logic to it, and everybody had to pass the poll tax. Then, in 1944, almost 30 years later, you see what we mean by slow, almost 30 years later, the Supreme Court found that literacy tests, the more blatant literacy tests, such as Louisiana, were unconstitutional. Not all of them, just the more blatantly discriminatory ones. But the practical result of these rulings were slight. And you see they were slow in coming. So what really happened was, again, 20 years after the 1944, so 21 years after that, the court suspended literacy tests altogether. Now notice, it's also important to notice, they didn't do away with them. They temporarily suspended them. Now the reality is they've still been temporarily suspended even to this day. But the Voting Rights Act of 1965, if you go back to the 15th Amendment, this is this portion right here. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged in the United States by the United States or any state on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This is in the 1870s. It really doesn't take effect until you get the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There's really not improvement made or significant improvement made. This is where you begin to get significant improvement made. If you've ever wondered why, as a group, African Americans are upset, it's because these rights, even though their freedom came in the 1870s, these rights took so much longer to achieve. So 1965, almost 100 years after their freedom, they're barely getting a meaningful right to vote. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 suspended literacy tests altogether, and they're still suspended to this day. It also established voting examiners. What were voting examiners? They were individuals that would come in and check and see what was going on and examine a state's ballot returns. And if they found that registration of blacks in a state was, and also registrations, they examined registrations. And if they found that registrations of blacks within a state was less than 50% of the voting age population being registered to vote of blacks, they could go in and help them to register. There were criminal penalties established with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 for interfering with somebody's right to vote. Now, what happened with this? So these voting examiners that you see right here in this 1965 law, what happened was there was a case in Mississippi. Now, again, this didn't happen overnight. There was a case in Mississippi where a white sheriff and members of the Ku Klux Klan murdered, I want to say it was three of these voting examiners and people that came in to help register people in Mississippi. There was actually a a movie about this called Mississippi Burning with Gene Hackman. Um, I haven't. Yeah, it's an amazing movie. I haven't seen it for a long time, but amazing movie, and sad all at the same time. But with this time, Mississippi, voter registration for blacks went from 5% to 70% in 10 years. So you can see that black influence begins to improve because of this meaningful right to vote. George Wallace was a politician who openly was discriminatory against African Americans. And after this, in Mississippi, after this, even George Wallace courted the black vote because he knew that was the only way he was going to win. So you see, real rights come from a meaningful right to vote. In South Africa, when the apartheid ended and black South Africans got the right to vote, they literally, some of them walked miles, 8 hours for a polling place and stood in line for hours to vote. And that, of course, has changed South Africa. So real political power comes from a meaningful right to vote. Now, let's stop right there. In the next video, we'll pick up the 19th Amendment and women.